Hello everybody and welcome to this video in which we're going to look at Henry VIII. We're going to look at one of the key questions for A-level history and probably the most important question about the reign of Henry VIII, which relates to religion and intellectual ideas. So from the SPEC, the key question is, how far did intellectual and religious ideas change and develop, with what effects? We're going to look at this in some detail, and there's lots of really interesting and obviously very controversial stuff buried within this. So what does the SPEC say, and what are the key ideas you're going to be looking at? Well, the bullet point from the SPEC is religion, Renaissance ideas, reform of the church, continuity and change by 1547. And hopefully what this video will do will show you everything that you need in terms of being able to answer any question that's asked on those lines. This kind of suggests what you need to know about is you need to know about Renaissance ideas, you need to know about humanism, which is a key element of that. You're going to need to know about both Protestantism and Catholicism, as what we're going to see is continuity with the old Catholic ideas, and we're going to see change in a movement towards Protestantism. Renaissance is this cultural rebirth that occurred throughout Europe roughly from the 14th century through to the middle of the 17th century. It's based on the rediscovery of ideas from both ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And Henry VIII, particularly in his early reign, is seen as a true Renaissance prince and is praised throughout Europe and within England itself as such. And he was promoting in artistic trends and Renaissance thinkers such as More and Erasmus during his time in power. Humanism is an element that comes out of Renaissance ideas, and it's a belief in mankind's ability to improve, and it emphasis on education and that idea that that mankind can be improved through education. And it links through the idea of this process in the Renaissance. Henry was seen as a promoter of humanist thinkers, and we've already mentioned More and Erasmus, which are two keys of these. John Colet was another. And we see the development of education. So, for example, St Paul's School was refounded by John Colet in London. There's Magdalen College, Oxford, which promotes the ideas and philosophy of Plato, as does Corpus Christi and Cardinal College, both in Oxford, as does St John's College in Cambridge. So the teaching of the classics and classical ways of thinking and going away from some of the more superstitious and religious-based teachings of the medieval period are a really key element, and this gives us an aspect of Renaissance ideas coming into England, developing further than they had done under Henry VII, and so we've got elements of change. Now, the classical learning was mainly amongst the elite for fairly obvious reasons. To learn the key aspects of this, you needed to be able to read and write. And the royal family were at the forefront of this, and humanism was an important part of Henry VIII's education, and it is then also part of the education of his children. Henry promoted the ideas, and he needed well-educated diplomats to communicate with their European counterparts, and also show England to be a kind of modern, sophisticated country that was on par with and needed to be taken seriously by the other European powers. And humanism, as we've seen already, really influenced the ideas in schools. Some of the key thinkers were More, who was a thinker, writer and minister. We've got Pietro Torrigiano, who was a sculptor who sculpted the tombs of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and was commissioned directly by Henry VIII. We've got Hans Holbein, who was a key painter at this time, though you could argue that maybe some of his style lends more to the Gothic kind of tradition than the Renaissance. You've got Cardinal Wolsey, who was the leading member of the clergy, and also the probably leading minister in a large part of Henry's reign, and he was strongly influenced by Renaissance ideas, and we can see this in his building of Hampton Court, which was built very much in a Renaissance style. Now, the church faced a huge number of issues at this point of time, and though it is argued by some historians that this is overplayed and overemphasized because of the context of what comes next, but there were some issues that definitely faced the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church was increasingly associated with corruption. And there's a whole range of elements of this. There's pluralism, where you are receiving profits from more than one religious post. So, for example, you're bishop of two different places. There's simony, where you buy and sell office religious positions. There's absenteeism, where you're receiving profits from a post but not actually being present to perform any of the duties associated with that post. Now, Wolsey is probably the best example for all of these. He is guilty of all of these elements. And the wealth of the Pope and the high clergy was in stark contrast to that of the poor, and could be seen really in terms of a lot of critics were trying to say, well, the church is taking advantage of people and is using this for their own gain rather than for the glorification of the religion and following religious teachings. And one of the other key examples of this was indulgences, which was when essentially you could get time off from purgatory by paying the church money. And therefore the wealthy would spend less time in purgatory. And again, a lot of people sort of look at this and go, well, this is quite clearly corrupt, and the Catholic Church was using this for the building of the great church in Rome. We also start to see anti-clericalism, which links to the idea of corruption, and its opposition to the political and social importance of the clergy. So we had common lawyers who objected to the use of canon law, church law, and they saw this as giving the clergy particular legal privileges. Much of anti-clericalism was based on the clergy not living as they should. I mean, some were alleged to have had wives, many had mistresses, including Wolsey. There were clergy who should have been chaste. They shouldn't have been indulging in any kind of sexual activity, but they had children. Wolsey, notably again, along with having a mistress, had a couple of kids. There were also lots of clergy who were accused not only of lewd behaviour but drunken behaviour, of dereliction of their duties, of having low levels of education and literacy, and very poor levels of religious knowledge. And therefore they weren't effective priests. They weren't people of moral high standing living in the monks in the monasteries. And so this led to people turning on the clergy. Again, this is an area for debate for historians, again really important in this unit, where you'll see some who say, well, this is definitely a big problem, and some will say, well, actually the government, the propaganda plays it up, particularly slightly later in Henry's reign, but it's not maybe something that was widely held ideas by all people. There were some really notable scandals. Probably the most important is Richard Hoons, who was a merchant who's found dead in the prison of the Bishop of London. He'd refused to pay the mortuary fee when one of his children had died very, very young. He was found apparently having hanged himself, but the coroner ruled that he couldn't possibly have done it himself, so this was murder, and it's murder therefore that's taken place in the prison of the Bishop of London, who's been seeking to get money out of a man who has just lost his child. It looks pretty bad for the church in this. The case was taken up in Parliament, and Wolsey was there on his knees begging for forgiveness on behalf of the church. So particularly humiliating for Wolsey himself, and again an element showing that maybe the church wasn't in as high a standing as it should have been or had been. Now, amongst all this, Wolsey is trying to reform the church. We can see this linking in with humanist ideas and the idea of improvement. He called on the bishops to be more rigorous in their inspection of monasteries and other religious institutions, and this led to about 20 of them being shut down. In 1528, he drew up plans to shut down monasteries that had less than 6 members, 6 monks, and to merge religious houses that had less than 12 people in them. He also removed 8 heads of monasteries who proved to be morally and spiritually unsuitable for their positions. and he promoted the education of the clergy, and this was something that he was particularly passionate about. And he had plans to set up Cardinal College, which is later created, but his fall means he's not there as it's finalised in Oxford. He also pushed for the creation of a school in Ipswich, which was where he was from. He'd helped Henry write a book attacking the ideas of Martin Luther that had earned Henry the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope. So we see here that Wolsey is trying to deal with some of these issues of anti-clericalism, but on the same hand is probably one of the worst examples in terms of things like pluralism and absenteeism, and also the fact he has a mistress and children. So, and he lives a really ostentatious life, and he's built this fabulous home. So Wolsey is a bit of a contradiction in all of this, as is the case with a lot of stuff to do with the church at this time. There were Protestant ideas spreading in England, and there had been Protestant ideas before. So back in the 14th century, we'd had the Lollards, and this was led initially by a guy called John Wycliffe, who had been dismissed in 1581 from the University of Oxford. Now, obviously, this is a long time before Henry VIII. But this, their ideas and their demand of reform of Western Christianity still kind of survived into this period. So the Lollards are, yes, they're from the 14th century, but the Lollards' ideas are still there in England at the time of Henry VIII. We also get these new ideas because we have Martin Luther's 95 Thesis produced in 1517, and bits of this start to reach England, or translations of this and copies of this start to reach England in the 1520s, brought in by merchants in the ports, particularly in the south and east coast. And we start to see the influence of this. And William Tyndale, who there's a picture of above me, started to publish parts of the Bible in English. The translation of the Bible into English so that people could read it themselves rather than just being told what it said by the clergy was a key element of Protestant thought at this time. And so Tyndale's work was something that was really significant for the spreading of Protestant ideas within England. But there were public burnings of Luther's text, and suspected Protestants were arrested, though none of them are actually executed until the 1530s. So we do see Protestant ideas, and we do see a reaction against those who hold them. The split with Rome is obviously the key thing in religion under Henry VIII. The supremacy of the Pope on religious issues is a key aspect of Catholicism. He's seen as God's representative. And the Pope's refusal to give Henry the divorce he wanted is what leads to the split with Rome. Again, it's highly debatable whether Henry, particularly him personally, took on any of the Protestant ideas, but what he didn't like was being told what he could and couldn't do by somebody else. Now, Wolsey fails to get the divorce, having tried various different methods, and so Henry turned to men who he knew or believed would be able to get him what he wanted. Now, these men held reformist Protestant leanings. They included Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, and they found the arguments that Henry wanted and the evidence that he needed to show that he was not merely a king, but he was an emperor, and therefore could defy Rome, and various kind of historical arguments, some of them going back to English mythology, which kind of suggested that he wasn't bound by the rule of the Pope. So Henry himself hasn't really converted to Protestantism, but he's surrounded by those who have sympathies in that direction: Cromwell, Cranmer, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Now, the split with Rome followed kind of further reform. There was a commissioning of an English Bible, which finally comes into full use from 1539. There's doctrinal changes in the 10 Articles of Faith, which included some Lutheran ideas, in particular a justification by faith, but by no means is it completely Lutheran. There is still plenty of Catholicism in it. The injunctions of 1536 and 1538 and the Bishop's Book of 1537 started attacking Catholic superstitions and some Catholic practices. So we do see some key elements in here of a movement towards Protestantism. The dissolution of the monasteries is another really key element of this. There were 825 religious houses in England. They were very wealthy. They owned huge amounts of land. There was key things happening, such as prayers for the dead. They were seen as possible centres for opposition. By 1540, they were all closed. So dissolution and opposition. Well, the stages of dissolution are on this part of the video. So we see Cromwell's commissioners started surveying monastic lands to work out how wealthy they were, and this was going to be the key element in winning Henry over. Whilst the second group went round to look into the moral and spiritual standards, and obviously they were pushed out with the key aim to find problems with the moral and spiritual standards, which would then give a justification of closing those monasteries, which would give the crown the right to take all of the wealth that they held. In 1536, we see an act of Parliament means that the smaller monasteries, those rated as having less than £200 income a year, were shut, and commissioners were sent out to oversee this. And these commissioners going out and this element of shutting these monasteries leads to the Pilgrimage of Grace, which I'll look at later in the video. The closures continued in 1537 and 1538, though bribery was quite common in an attempt to try and save the monasteries, obviously fruitless and giving away money for no good reason. There was a group of Carthusian monks who opposed the closure of their monastery, although they were executed on orders of Henry VIII. In 1539, we get the Act of Dissolution of larger monasteries, and at this point we're getting moved to this point of them all getting closed down, where they got the Court of Augmentation under Richard Rich, who gets very rich. He's the most perfectly named minister, I think, of all time, Richard Rich, or Richie Rich as he's often referred to, and he was set up to handle all the property and wealth from the monasteries. He was a key supporter of Cromwell. So dissolution and opposition continued. Well, we met Thomas More earlier as a key humanist thinker. Well, he refuses to swear an oath recognising the children of Anne Boleyn as the heirs to the throne. He's sent to the Tower. Richard Rich allegedly heard him saying he didn't accept Henry as head of the church. It's very scant evidence, but it was enough to get More executed for treason. And this shows that somebody as close to the king, as powerful, as influential as More, the fact that he could be executed shows that Henry wasn't going to stand for any opposition at all. We have the Aragonese faction, a small group of Catholic courtiers who supported first of all Catherine of Aragon and then her daughter Mary. When Mary was excluded from the succession in 1536, two of the Aragonese faction, Lord Darcy and Lord Hussey, joined the Pilgrimage of Grace. Henry Courtenay, who was the Marquess of Exeter, was a key member of the Aragonese faction, and he became associated with Reginald Pole, who was writing some very outspoken stuff against Henry's religious reforms. He incidentally later becomes cardinal and archbishop under Mary. Courtenay, for his associations with Reginald Pole, is executed in 1539. Another area of opposition is just quite an amazing story. It's the story of Elizabeth Barton, the nun of Kent. She's said to have had visions, one of which came from the Virgin Mary, who cured her of an illness in 1525. Her visions then started to focus on a very dangerous topic, the king's marriage. And she went as far, according to reports, as telling Henry to his face that divorcing Catherine would lead to his death within a month. It is likely that she's just a pawn being used by her mentor, Edward Bocking, a Canterbury monk, and others to spread opposition to religious changes. Bocking and Elizabeth Barton and other conspirators are arrested in 1533. She publicly confessed her visions to be false in 1534 and is then executed. Now, the chances are she genuinely believed her visions and she was just manipulated. But again, this shows not only was there opposition, but the extent to which Henry would go to overcome it. The most significant opposition to Henry's religious policies was the Pilgrimage of Grace. This starts with a rebellion in Louth, Lincolnshire, in October 1536 over rumours the commissioners were going into the parish churches and going to remove all the ornaments. The rebellion are joined by gentry and then monks, and they march on Lincoln. Now, this group are dispersed under threat from a royal army under the Duke of Suffolk. But the ideas then spread over to Yorkshire. So Robert Aske had visited the rebels at Caister, and then he travelled towards York, picking up support as he went. Him and his supporters seized Pontefract Castle and produced the Pontefract Articles, which were 24 really wide-ranging demands, including the suppression of what they saw as Protestant heresy, the restoration of religious houses, Princess Mary being returned to the line of succession, the removal of various taxes, and particularly taxed Cromwell. And they had various other things about enclosure and a whole range of local complaints and issues as well. Aske and his men reached Doncaster. There's 40,000 men strong at this point. Now they came face to face with a much smaller force, the Royal Army under the Duke of Norfolk, to whom they presented their demands that they created in the Pontefract Articles. And Norfolk promises that these will be taken to the King and Parliament, who would consider them. He also had authority from Henry to give them a general pardon. Aske is then even invited to join the King for Christmas and is given various gifts. Now Henry really is just biding his time, because there's a fresh rebellion in 1537 when it's clear that nothing really is happening, following which the crushing of which Aske and others are arrested and executed, and so are countless others across the north of England. So we see here Henry acting very, very harshly when he can, and playing it a bit more cautiously when he needs to, when he's faced with an army of 40,000 men. We then see in the final years of Henry's reign this real problem with factionalism. So Cromwell was executed in 1540, and then we see this swinging from in between two factions during the 1540s. We see the Reform faction, the Conservative faction, and they're kind of competing to get influence over Henry, and as a result of which they do seem to get some influence over Henry, and religious reform seems to swing one way and then back again. The Conservative faction are headed by the Duke of Norfolk and also by Bishop Gardiner, and they had several successes. So, for example, the passing of the Six Articles Act in 1539, the removing of Cromwell in 1540, and arranging the marriage to the Duke of Norfolk's niece, Catherine Howard. Now, those successes would be fairly short-lived, but we do see a swing back towards a more conservative Catholic-style religion whilst they are holding sway. The Reform faction was headed by Edward Seymour, who was the older brother of Jane Seymour and therefore uncle to the future King Edward, as well as Archbishop Cranmer, who has been in post since the split with Rome. Now, Seymour was associated with some military success in Scotland. The Reform faction very much profited from the fall of Catherine Howard and the marriage to Catherine Parr, who herself was a leading reformer and brought reformers in around her at court, and oversaw a kind of reformist education of both Edward and Elizabeth. They saw off plots against Cranmer in 1543 and Catherine Parr in 1546 by the Conservative faction. Cranmer was actually put in charge of the investigation into his own alleged heresy by Henry VIII. So you can imagine the outcome of that's going to be fairly clear cut, and Catherine Parr gets the backing of Henry. They in the middle of all this accused Gardiner of wanting to return to the Pope in 1544, and this led to his decline in influence. In 1546, another key reformer, Anthony Denny, became Chief Chancellor of the Privy Chamber and controlled the dry stamp, and that really helped the Reform faction consolidate their position, as does the arrest of Norfolk and his son for treason, something that Norfolk escapes execution really just because Henry dies, whilst his son didn't. So the Reform faction is dominant by the end. The position in 1547 is slightly complicated. It is really difficult to determine whether the English people are Catholic or Protestant. Catholic traditions were still widespread, and so we think, particularly looking at what happened in the reigns of Edward and Mary, so was Catholic belief. Protestant support seemed to be concentrated in London, in the southeast, in particular in ports where the ideas seemed to spread in from Europe. And obviously it was most prominent amongst the educated elites, because they are more likely to be able to read these new ideas and therefore be exposed to them. Many key Catholic doctrines remained in place in the church, such as transubstantiation, the idea that during the Eucharist or Mass as it's known, the bread and the wine is transformed into the blood and body of Christ. Confession to a priest of your sins remained a key part of religious doctrine. The 7 Catholic sacraments remained in place. It remained the rule that clergy could not marry, though those who had married in the intervening bit where they had been allowed, or when they'd been abroad, were allowed to keep their wives, kind of, but generally kept it secret. Only the clergy could receive both bread and wine in the Eucharist, and the ordinary laity would receive only the bread. However, we did see the Great Bible of 1539 being in English, which is a key kind of Protestant ideal, and that replaced the Latin Bible. Saints' days, which seems part of a superstition of a Catholic time, were reduced to 25, but not completely removed. Pilgrimages by the laity were forbidden, and also in 1545 we see the adding of some English into services, though they are still predominantly in Latin. So England was neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant. And though Henry himself received full Catholic rights on his deathbed, and most historians agree that he was Catholic until the day he died. So this is going to leave England in a bit of a pickle and in a rather dangerous position as it goes into the next stage, which we will look at, which is known in later videos, which is known as the Mid-Tudor Crisis. And the children of Henry VIII don't really inherit a nice clear situation, because we've got this mixture in place by 1547, and the population are neither completely one thing nor the other, and the church's doctrine was neither one thing nor the other, and therefore religion is in a slightly complicated position. I hope this video has been helpful for you. Please remember to like. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe, and you will find a whole series of videos on all aspects of history and politics. But if you're watching this video, what is probably particularly interesting to you is there is a playlist on Tudor England which looks at the A-level course and focuses on Henry VII, and then these videos on Henry VIII, and we'll go on to Edward, Mary and Elizabeth as well. Thank you very much for watching.